You know what's wild? Right now, as you're watching this video, your money is literally losing value. Not because you're spending it, not because someone's stealing it, but because of this invisible force called inflation that's quietly eating away at your purchasing power like a very polite but persistent termite. And here's the kicker. Almost nobody actually understands how it works. Sure, everyone complains about it. Your grandpa tells you about how he bought his house for 3 nickels and a handshake. Your parents grumble about gas prices. You're probably wondering why your coffee costs more than a small car payment, but ask someone to actually explain inflation, and you'll get a lot of hand-waving, some mumbling about printing money, and maybe a rant about the government that goes nowhere productive. So today, we're going to fix that. We're diving deep into the weird, fascinating, and occasionally infuriating world of inflation. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what inflation is, but why it happens, how it's measured, who it helps, who it hurts, and why every economist in the world has a different opinion about whether 2% inflation is perfect or the beginning of the apocalypse. Fair warning, this is going to be a journey. We're talking about one of the most fundamental forces in economics, something that affects literally every financial decision you make, from buying groceries to planning retirement. So buckle up, grab a snack, which probably costs more than it did last year, and let's figure out why everything seems to get more expensive over time. Part 1. The basics. What is inflation anyway? Chapter 1. The simple definition that's actually complicated. Let's start with the textbook definition. Inflation is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services rises, and consequently, the purchasing power of currency falls. Okay, great, super helpful. Let me translate that into English. Inflation means that over time, your money buys less stuff. $1 today will buy you less than $1 bought you last year. And $1 next year will buy you even less than today's dollar. It's like your money is on a very slow, very predictable diet. Here's a concrete example. In 1970, the average price of a movie ticket in the United States was about $1.55. Today, it's around $11. Same movie experience. Well, actually, today's experience is probably worse because someone's always on their phone, but it costs 7 times more. That's inflation in action. But here's where it gets interesting. Inflation isn't just things cost more. That's the symptom. The actual phenomenon is more nuanced. Inflation represents a decrease in the purchasing power of money. The money itself doesn't change. A dollar bill from 1970 looks pretty similar to a dollar bill today, minus some design updates. But what that dollar can command in the marketplace has fundamentally shifted. Think of it this way, money is really just a claim on resources. When you have a dollar, you're holding a little piece of paper that says, I can exchange this for goods and services. Inflation means that claim gets weaker over time. Your dollar is still a dollar, but it's a claim on less stuff. Now you might be thinking, wait, isn't this just a fancy way of saying prices go up? Kind of, but not exactly. And this distinction matters because it helps us understand what's actually happening in the economy. When we say prices are rising, we're looking at it from the perspective of goods and services. A hamburger costs more, a car costs more, a house costs more. But when we talk about inflation, we're looking at it from the perspective of money. The value of money is falling. Why does this distinction matter? Because it changes how we think about solutions. If the problem is prices are too high, maybe we try to control prices. But if the problem is money is losing value, we need to look at what's happening with the money supply, monetary policy, and the broader economy. Chapter 2. A brief history of things. Getting more expensive. Inflation isn't new. Like, really not new. People have been complaining about rising prices for literally thousands of years. The ancient Romans dealt with inflation. There's a documented price crisis in the Roman Empire around 200 to 300 AD, where the Emperor Diocletian got so frustrated with rising prices that he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, which basically said nothing can cost more than this. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Turns out you can't just decree economic forces away. Who knew? Medieval Europe had inflation problems. The discovery of massive silver deposits in the Americas in the 16th century led to what historians call the price revolution in Europe. Suddenly, there was way more silver, which was used as money, floating around, and surprise, prices went up. This was actually one of the first large-scale examples that helped economists understand the relationship between money supply and prices. And don't even get me started on the 20th century. We had the hyperinflation in Weimar Germany in the 1920s, where prices doubled every few days and people literally needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread. There's a famous photo of kids playing with blocks made of bundled currency because the money was worth less than the paper it was printed on. More recently, we had the inflation of the 1970s and early 1980s in the United States and other developed countries, where inflation rates hit double digits and people thought the entire economic system might collapse. We had Zimbabwe in the 2000s, where inflation got so bad they eventually issued a $100 trillion banknote. Venezuela in the 2000s and 10s experienced hyperinflation that destroyed their economy. The point is, inflation is a persistent feature of monetary economies. It's not a bug, it's not an accident. It's something that emerges from how we structure our economic systems, and understanding it is crucial to navigating modern financial life. Chapter 3: Good inflation, Bad inflation, and the Goldilocks zone. Here's something that confuses a lot of people. Economists don't think all inflation is bad. In fact, most economists think some inflation is actually good. I know. It sounds insane. How can money losing value be good? Isn't that obviously bad? Well, let's think about it. Imagine an economy with zero inflation. Prices never change. A hamburger costs the same today as it did last year and will cost the same next year. Sounds pretty good, right? But here's the problem. If prices aren't going up, there's a really good incentive to just hold on to your money. Why buy something today when it'll cost the same tomorrow? Why invest in a business when you can just stuff cash under your mattress and it'll be worth the same amount forever? This is called deflation, when prices actually fall, and it can be economically disastrous. Japan dealt with this for decades, the lost decades, starting in the 1990s. When people expect prices to fall, they delay purchases. When everyone delays purchases, businesses make less money. When businesses make less money, they cut jobs. When they cut jobs, people have less money to spend. And round we go in a deflationary spiral. So economists generally agree that a little bit of inflation is actually healthy. It encourages spending and investment. It keeps money moving through the economy. The general consensus is that around 2% annual inflation is the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. Why 2% specifically? Honestly, it's kind of arbitrary. There's no magical economic law that says 2% is perfect, but it's low enough that it doesn't seriously erode purchasing power or cause major problems, and high enough that it keeps the economy moving and gives central banks room to maneuver during recessions. But here's where it gets messy. Not all inflation is created equal. There's good inflation that comes from a growing, healthy economy where demand is strong and businesses are thriving. And there's bad inflation that comes from supply shocks, economic mismanagement, or pure currency debasement. The inflation you get when the economy is booming and unemployment is low, that's generally okay. The inflation you get when a government prints money to finance deficits while the economy is struggling, that's the dangerous kind. And this is why inflation debates get so heated. People aren't just arguing about numbers, they're arguing about what those numbers mean for the underlying health of the economy. Part 2. The mechanics. How does inflation actually happen? Chapter 4. Too much money chasing. Too few goods. Alright, let's get into the actual mechanics. How does inflation happen? What causes it? The most classic explanation, and the one your economics professor probably started with, is this elegant little phrase, too much money chasing too few goods. It's almost poetic, isn't it? And it captures the essence of demand-pull inflation, which is when inflation happens because there's more demand for stuff than there is stuff to buy. Here's a simple example. Imagine there are 100 people in an economy and 100 apples. Everyone has $1 and apples cost $1. Perfect balance. Everyone gets an apple. Now imagine that overnight, everyone suddenly has $2, but there are still only 100 apples. What happens? Well, people are willing to pay more for those apples because they have more money. The price of apples goes up, maybe they go up to $2. Now we're back in balance, everyone can buy one apple, but the price has doubled. That's inflation. This is essentially what happens when the money supply grows faster than the actual productive capacity of the economy. You have more dollars, euros, pounds, or whatever, but you don't have more stuff to buy with that money, so prices adjust upward. This is why central banks pay so much attention to the money supply. When they print money, which these days mostly means creating digital money through various banking mechanisms, they're increasing the amount of money in the economy. If they do this faster than the economy is actually growing, you get inflation. The COVID-19 pandemic is actually a perfect recent example of this. Governments around the world pump trillions of dollars into their economies through stimulus checks, business loans, unemployment benefits, and other programs. The money supply exploded. At the same time, production of goods and services was constrained because of lockdowns and supply chain disruptions. Result? The highest inflation rates in decades. Too much money, because governments created a lot of it. Chasing too few goods, because the pandemic disrupted production and supply chains. Textbook Demand Pull Inflation. Chapter 5. When Supply Gets Weird. But demand pull inflation isn't the only game in town. There's also cost push inflation, which happens when the costs of producing goods and services go up, and businesses pass those costs on to consumers. Think about oil prices. Oil is an input for basically everything in a modern economy. It fuels transportation, it's used in manufacturing, it's a component in plastics and chemicals. When oil prices spike, like they did in the 1970s with the OPEC oil embargo, or in the 2000s, or more recently in 2022 with the Russia-Ukraine war, the cost of making and shipping stuff goes up. And what do businesses do when their costs go up? They raise prices. The bakery pays more for delivery, so bread costs more. The manufacturer pays more for plastic pellets, so your new phone case costs more. The airline pays more for jet fuel, so your ticket costs more. This creates a ripple effect through the entire economy. And here's the nasty part. This kind of inflation can happen even when the overall economy isn't doing great. You can have high unemployment, slow growth, and still have significant inflation if there are major supply shocks. Economists call this stagflation, stagnant growth plus inflation, and it's generally considered the worst of both worlds. The 1970s were defined by stagflation. The economy was struggling, unemployment was high, but inflation was also running rampant because of oil price shocks and other supply-side problems. It broke a lot of economic models that assumed inflation and unemployment moved in opposite directions. Chapter 6. The Wage Price Spiral, or How Everyone Tries to Keep Up and Nobody Wins. Now let's talk about one of the most insidious mechanisms in inflation, the wage price spiral. Here's how it works. Prices go up for whatever reason. Workers notice that their money doesn't go as far as it used to. They demand higher wages to compensate. Businesses grant these higher wages. But now, businesses have higher labor costs, so they raise prices to cover those higher costs, which means workers' wages don't go as far again, so they demand higher wages. And round we go. It's like a terrible merry-go-round where everyone is running faster and faster, but nobody actually gets ahead. This was a huge problem in the 1970s. Unions would negotiate contracts with automatic cost of living adjustments, COLAs, which meant wages automatically increased with inflation. Sounds great for workers, right? The problem was that this baked inflation into the system. Businesses knew wages were going up, so they preemptively raised prices, which triggered the COLAs, which led to more price increases. The wage price spiral is particularly dangerous because it can create inflation expectations. When people expect prices to keep rising, they change their behavior in ways that actually cause prices to keep rising. It becomes self-fulfilling. Breaking a wage price spiral is really hard. Usually it requires some kind of shock to the system. Typically a recession induced by the central bank raising interest rates to painful levels. That's essentially what happened in the early 1980s when Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker jacked interest rates up to around 20% to break the back of inflation. It worked, but it also caused a severe recession. Chapter 7. Printing money, but not really. We need to talk about printing money because this phrase gets thrown around constantly and it's usually wrong. When people say the government is printing money, they usually conjure an image of literal printing presses churning out cash. And while yes, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing does print physical currency, that's not really what drives inflation or what people mean when they talk about money creation. Most money in a modern economy isn't physical, it's digital. It exists as numbers in bank accounts and on computer servers, and most money isn't created by the government directly. It's created by the banking system through a process called fractional reserve banking. Here's the simplified version. You deposit $100 in a bank. The bank is required to keep a fraction of that, let's say 10%, in reserve. So they keep $10 and loan out $90 to someone else. That person takes the $90 and deposits it in their bank, or spends it, and whoever receives it deposits it. Now that bank keeps $9 in reserve and loans out $81, and so on. The original $100 has now become $100, your deposit, plus $90, the loan, plus $81, the second loan, plus, you get the idea. Money has been created out of thin air through the magic of fractional reserve banking. This is how the money supply expands beyond the physical currency in circulation. Central banks influence this process mainly through interest rates and reserve requirements. When the Federal Reserve, or the European Central Bank, or the Bank of England, or whatever, wants to increase the money supply, they lower interest rates, making it cheaper to borrow money. This encourages more lending, which creates more money. When they want to decrease the money supply or slow its growth, they raise interest rates. They can also do more direct interventions, like quantitative easing, QE, where the central bank literally buys bonds and other assets from banks, injecting money directly into the financial system. This is what happened on a massive scale after the 2008 financial crisis, and again during COVID-19. So when people complain about money printing, what they usually mean is that the central bank is expanding the money supply through these various mechanisms, which can lead to inflation if done excessively. But actual printing of physical cash is a tiny, almost irrelevant part of the process. Part 3. Measuring the invisible. How do we know inflation is happening? Chapter 8. The Consumer Price Index, or How Economists Stock Your Shopping Cart. Alright, so we know what inflation is and how it happens. But here's a practical question. How do we actually measure it? How do we know if inflation is 2% or 5% or 10%? You can't just feel inflation happening. Well, you can feel it when your grocery bill is higher, but that's not exactly scientific. Enter the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. This is the most commonly cited measure of inflation, and it's basically a giant shopping list that economists use to track how prices change over time. Here's how it works. Government statisticians create a hypothetical basket of goods and services that represents what an average household buys. This basket includes everything from food and housing to healthcare and entertainment. They track the prices of all these items every month and then calculate how much the total cost of the basket has changed. If the basket cost $100 last year and $102 this year, congratulations, you've got 2% inflation. Sounds simple, right? Well, buckle up, because this is where things get wonderfully complicated and controversial. First, what exactly goes in the basket? The current CPI basket includes something like 80,000 different items, grouped into about 200 categories. It includes obvious stuff like bread, milk, and gasoline, but it also includes cable TV subscriptions, pet food, college tuition, funeral expenses, and literally thousands of other things. The weights of these items are based on surveys of what people actually spend their money on. Housing is the biggest component, making up about a third of the CPI. Transportation is another big chunk. Food, healthcare, education, all represented based on their share of typical household spending. But here's the first problem. The typical household is a fiction. Your spending probably doesn't match the CPI basket. If you're a college student, education costs are a huge part of your budget. If you're elderly, healthcare is probably a bigger deal. If you live in a city, you might not even own a car. So, transportation costs hit you differently. This means the official inflation rate might not match your personal inflation rate at all. And this isn't just theoretical nitpicking, it has real consequences. Social Security benefits are adjusted based on CPI. Labor contracts often include cost of living adjustments tied to CPI. Tax brackets are indexed to CPI. So if the CPI doesn't accurately reflect your reality, these adjustments won't either. Chapter 9. The Substitution Problem, or when you start buying chicken because beef got too expensive. Now let's talk about one of the most controversial aspects of CPI, substitution effects. Here's the issue. When the price of something goes up, people don't just keep buying it at the same rate, they substitute. If beef gets expensive, you buy more chicken. If oranges are pricey this season, you buy apples instead. If going to the movies gets too costly, you stay home and watch Netflix. So should CPI account for this substitution? Some economists say yes. The CPI should reflect what people actually do, which is adjust their consumption patterns when prices change. Others say no. The point of CPI is to measure how much it costs to maintain the same standard of living, not to measure how people adapt to higher prices. The current CPI methodology actually does account for substitution to some degree. It uses what's called a chained index that allows for some substitution within categories. So if you switch from one brand of cereal to another because the first got too expensive, that's captured. But critics argue this understates true inflation. They say, if you're being forced to buy chicken instead of beef because beef got too expensive, your standard of living has decreased, and the inflation measure should reflect that. The CPI might say inflation is only 3%, but if you're eating chicken instead of the beef you prefer, your personal economic situation has deteriorated more than that 3% suggests. This isn't just academic quibbling. The government has changed CPI methodology several times over the decades, often in ways that reduce the measured inflation rate. Some people, particularly those critical of government policy, argue this is deliberate manipulation to keep Social Security cost of living adjustments lower and to make the economy look better than it really is. I'm not going to take a side on whether this is true, but it's worth knowing that CPI isn't some objective, unchanging scientific measurement. It's a construct, and the way we construct it involves choices that affect what we measure. Chapter 10: Quality Changes and the Problem of Comparing Apples to iPhones. Here's another brain melter. How do you account for quality changes? Think about it. A car today has anti-lock brakes, airbags, backup cameras, Bluetooth connectivity, and probably a computer more powerful than what NASA used to land on the moon. A car from 1970 was basically a metal box with wheels and an engine that would kill you if you crashed at anything over 20 miles per hour. So when we compare the price of a car today to the price of a car in 1970, are we really comparing the same thing? The 1970 car might have cost $3,000, and today's car might cost $35,000. That looks like massive inflation. The car costs more than 10 times as much. But the modern car is also vastly superior in pretty much every way. How do you account for that in your inflation measurement? This is called the quality adjustment problem, and it's enormously complicated. CPI statisticians actually do try to account for quality improvements. They use something called hedonic regression, yes, that's really what it's called, to estimate how much of a price increase is due to inflation and how much is due to genuine quality improvements. So if a new model of refrigerator costs $100 more than the old model, but it's also more energy efficient, larger, and has fancy ice making capabilities, the CPI might count only $50 of that as inflation, attributing the other $50 to quality improvements. This seems reasonable in theory, but it's incredibly subjective in practice. Who decides how much value those improvements have? And what about when improvements aren't really improvements to everyone? Let me give you a concrete example. Smartphones. The original iPhone in 2007 cost $599. The iPhone 15 Pro Max in 2024 costs $1,199. That's double. But the iPhone 15 is phenomenally more capable, better camera, faster processor, bigger screen, more storage, 5G connectivity, and on and on. Is the iPhone twice as expensive, or is it actually cheaper when you account for how much more it can do? The CPI methodology would say it's actually cheaper on a quality-adjusted basis. But if you're the person trying to buy a phone, you're still paying $1,199 regardless of the quality adjustments. And here's where it gets really wild. Some economists argue that quality improvements actually mean we've understated how much economic progress we've made. Yeah, prices have gone up, but we're also getting much better stuff. The quality of life improvements from modern technology, medicine, and other innovations might mean we're actually way better off than simple price comparisons would suggest. Other economists say this is nonsense, that these quality adjustments are overblown and hide real declines in affordability and purchasing power. Welcome to economics, where even basic measurements are controversial. Chapter 11: Core Inflation and Why Economists Ignore Food and Energy. Sort of. Let me introduce you to one of the most frustrating concepts in inflation measurement: core inflation. Core inflation is inflation excluding food and energy prices. Yes, you read that right. Economists often look at an inflation measure that deliberately excludes two of the things you spend the most money on. Why on earth would they do this? Have economists lost their minds? Are they so out of touch that they don't realize people need to eat and put gas in their cars? Well, there's actually a logic to it, even if it seems insane at first glance. Food and energy prices are extremely volatile. They can swing wildly from month to month based on weather, geopolitical events, seasonal factors, and other temporary issues. Oil prices might spike because of a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico or a conflict in the Middle East. Orange juice prices might jump because of a frost in Florida. These are important and they affect people's budgets, but they don't necessarily tell you about underlying inflation trends. Core inflation is meant to capture the more persistent fundamental inflation trends in the economy. It's trying to answer the question, if we strip away the noise and volatility, what's the underlying inflation rate? Think of it like this. If you're trying to understand climate change, you don't just look at whether today was hot or cold. You look at long-term trends averaged over years. That's what core inflation is trying to do for prices. Central banks actually care a lot about core inflation because it gives them a better sense of what's happening with underlying price pressures. If headline inflation spikes because oil prices jumped, but core inflation is stable, the Fed might not react. But if core inflation is creeping up, that suggests more fundamental price pressures building in the economy, and they might need to take action. That said, regular people are absolutely right to be frustrated when economists talk about core inflation while food and gas prices are skyrocketing. If you're spending an extra $100 a month on groceries and gas, it doesn't help to hear that core inflation is only 2%. You're experiencing real inflation in your actual life, regardless of what the core measure says. This is why most serious economic analysis looks at both headline inflation, which includes everything, and core inflation, which excludes food and energy. They're both useful, but for different purposes. Chapter 12: Other inflation measures, because one index is never enough. Just to make things even more fun, CPI isn't the only inflation measure out there. Not even close. There's the Producer Price Index, PPI, which measures the prices that producers receive for their goods. This is kind of like inflation viewed from the business side rather than the consumer side. PPI often moves before CPI because increases in production costs eventually get passed on to consumers. There's the GDP deflator, which measures the prices of all goods and services produced in the economy, not just those consumed by households. This is broader than CPI and includes things like government services and business investment. There's the Personal Consumption Expenditures, PCE Index, which is actually the Federal Reserve's preferred inflation measure. It's similar to CPI, but uses different methodology and covers a slightly different basket of goods. PCE tends to show lower inflation than CPI, which is convenient for the Fed when they're trying to argue inflation is under control. There are trimmed mean measures, which cut out the extreme price changes, both the biggest increases and the biggest decreases, to get at the central tendency of price changes. There are even things like the Billion Prices Project, which uses online pricing data to create real-time inflation estimates based on millions of prices scraped from the internet every day. Why so many measures? Because inflation is genuinely hard to measure, and different measures are useful for different purposes. They also sometimes tell different stories, which is why you'll see economists cherry-picking whichever inflation measure supports their argument. In 2021 and 2022, you saw this in action. Some economists pointed to CPI and said, inflation is out of control. Others pointed to PCE and said, it's not as bad as you think. Both were technically correct, but they were looking at different measures. The lesson here, whenever someone cites an inflation number, always ask which measure they're using and why. The answer can tell you a lot about what story they're trying to tell. Part 4. The Human Impact. Who wins and who loses? Chapter 13. Creditors versus debtors, or the great wealth transfer you've never heard of. Alright, let's get into the really important stuff. Who does inflation actually help, and who does it hurt? The single most important dynamic to understand is the relationship between creditors, people who are owed money, and debtors, people who owe money. Inflation fundamentally redistributes wealth between these two groups. Here's why. When you borrow money, you borrow it in nominal terms. If you take out a $300,000 mortgage, you owe $300,000. That number doesn't change based on inflation, but the real value of that debt, what it actually represents in terms of purchasing power, absolutely does change with inflation. Let's say you take out that $300,000 mortgage in 2020. If there's 5% inflation every year for 10 years, by 2030, that $300,000 debt is worth a lot less in real terms. Your nominal payments might be the same, but you're paying them back with dollars that are worth less than the dollars you borrowed. This is fantastic if you're the borrower. You borrowed expensive dollars, and you're paying back cheaper dollars. You're effectively getting a discount on your debt. But if you're the lender, the bank that gave you that mortgage, this is terrible. They lent you expensive dollars, and they're being repaid in cheaper dollars. They're losing purchasing power. This is why inflation is often described as a transfer of wealth from creditors to debtors. And in a modern economy where most people have some kind of debt, mortgages, student loans, car loans, credit cards, this matters a lot. Who are the biggest debtors in modern economies? Governments. The US government has over $36 trillion in debt. Inflation is actually great for the government because it reduces the real value of that debt. They borrowed money when dollars were worth more, and they're paying it back, to the extent they pay it back at all, with dollars that are worth less. Who are the creditors? Well, anyone who holds government bonds, which includes a lot of retirees, pension funds, foreign governments, and individual savers. These people are being slowly screwed by inflation. This is why some economists who are sympathetic to debtors actually favor moderate inflation. It helps people pay off their mortgages and student loans. It reduces the debt burden. It transfers wealth from rich creditors to typically less rich debtors. Other economists, particularly those sympathetic to savers and creditors, view inflation as a form of theft. It's the government stealing from people who saved prudently and lent money in good faith. Both perspectives have merit, which is why this debate gets so heated. Chapter 14. The Fixed Income Trap. Let's talk about one of the cruelest aspects of inflation, what it does to people on fixed incomes. Imagine you're retired. You worked for 40 years, saved diligently, and now you're living on a fixed pension of $3,000 per month. When you retired in 2010, that $3,000 covered your expenses comfortably. You could pay your bills, buy groceries, go out to eat occasionally, and still have money left over. Now it's 2025. If we've had just 3% inflation every year, which is actually pretty modest, prices have increased by about 58% over those 15 years. But your pension is still $3,000 per month. Your income hasn't changed, but everything costs 58% more. That comfortable retirement has become a struggle. You're cutting back on meals out, you're buying cheaper groceries, you're worried about unexpected expenses because you don't have the cushion you used to have. You might even be going into debt just to maintain your standard of living. This is the fixed income trap, and it's brutal. Now, some pensions do have cost of living adjustments, COLAs. Social Security in the US has annual adjustments based on CPI. But remember all those problems with CPI we talked about earlier? If the CPI understates your personal inflation rate, which it might, especially for elderly people who spend more on healthcare, then the COLA doesn't fully protect you. And many private pensions don't have COLAs at all. You get what you get, and inflation slowly destroys your purchasing power. This is also why inflation is particularly harmful to the elderly. They're more likely to be on fixed incomes, more likely to have their wealth in savings and bonds, which lose value with inflation, rather than stocks and real estate, which can potentially keep up with inflation, and less able to increase their income by working more. When economists talk about inflation being a tax on savers, this is what they mean. If you saved money responsibly for retirement, inflation is systematically punishing you for that prudence. Chapter 15. The Asset Price Boom, or How Inflation Makes the Rich Richer. Now let's talk about something that makes a lot of people angry. How inflation affects asset prices. Here's the thing. Inflation doesn't affect all prices equally. Consumer goods prices might go up 3% per year, but asset prices, stocks, real estate, gold, Bitcoin, whatever, can go up way faster than that. Why? Because when there's a lot of money sloshing around in the economy and interest rates are low, which often happens when central banks are trying to manage inflation, that money has to go somewhere, and a lot of it flows into assets. Think about it from an investor's perspective. If inflation is running at 5% and savings accounts are paying 1% interest, you're losing purchasing power by keeping money in the bank. You need to find somewhere else to put your money. Stocks, real estate, commodities, cryptocurrency, anything that might keep up with or beat inflation. This creates a massive influx of money into asset markets, which drives up asset prices. And who owns assets? Primarily rich people. The wealthier you are, the higher percentage of your wealth is in stocks, real estate, and other assets rather than in cash or fixed income instruments. So inflation creates this perverse dynamic where consumer prices go up, which hurts regular people trying to buy groceries and pay rent. But asset prices go up even faster, which helps rich people who own stocks and real estate. The result? Inflation can actually increase wealth inequality. The rich get richer because their assets appreciate. The poor and middle class get poorer in relative terms because they don't own assets, or own very few, and their wages and savings don't keep up with inflation. This is one of the most underappreciated aspects of inflation. Everyone focuses on consumer prices, which is fair, but the wealth transfer that happens through asset price inflation is massive and deeply consequential. Look at what happened after 2008 and again after 2020. Central banks printed enormous amounts of money and pushed interest rates to near zero. Consumer inflation was relatively modest for a while, so people thought, hey, this is fine, no inflation problem. But asset prices went absolutely bonkers. The stock market hit record after record, real estate prices soared, billionaires got massively richer, and then when consumer inflation finally showed up in 2021 to 2022, it was regular people who got slammed. The wealth transfer had already happened through asset inflation. The consumer price inflation was just adding insult to injury. Chapter 16: Wages and the Rat Race. Let's talk about wages, because this is where inflation hits most people hardest. The key question is, do wages keep up with inflation? And the answer is sometimes kinda, maybe it depends. In a well-functioning economy with moderate inflation, wages should roughly keep up with inflation over time. As prices rise, workers demand higher wages, and in a competitive labor market, employers have to pay those higher wages to attract and retain workers. Everyone's nominal income goes up, prices go up, and in real terms, adjusting for inflation, things stay relatively stable. That's the theory anyway. Reality is messier. First, there are lags. Inflation might pick up suddenly, but wages don't adjust instantly. If you get an annual raise, you might have to wait a whole year to get a wage increase that compensates for inflation that already happened. In the meantime, you're losing purchasing power. Second, not all workers have equal bargaining power. If you're in a strong labor union or you have in-demand skills, you might be able to negotiate wage increases that match or exceed inflation. But if you're in a weak bargaining position, maybe you work in a declining industry, or you don't have specialized skills, or labor supply is high, you might not get raises that keep up with inflation. This creates winners and losers even within the working population. Some workers can keep up, others fall behind. Third, there's a psychological element. People tend to attribute wage increases to their own merit and skill, but they attribute price increases to inflation or corporate greed or whatever. So even if your wages are keeping up with inflation in real terms, it might not feel that way. You might think, I got a 3% raise because I'm doing good work, while simultaneously thinking, everything costs 3% more because of inflation. You're treading water in real terms, but it feels like you're falling behind. This is called money illusion. People think in nominal terms rather than real terms, and it matters because it affects morale, political attitudes, and economic behavior. Here's a concrete example. Let's say you make $50,000 per year. You get a 3% raise, so now you make $51,500. You feel pretty good about that extra $1,500. But if inflation is also 3%, your real income hasn't changed at all. You're making more dollars, but those dollars buy the same amount of stuff as before. Compare that to a scenario where you get a 0% raise, but there's also 0% inflation. In real terms, this is identical to the first scenario. Your purchasing power is unchanged, but psychologically, it feels totally different. In the first case, you got a raise. In the second case, you feel stagnant and unappreciated. This is why some economists argue that moderate inflation is useful because it allows for wage adjustments without nominal wage cuts. If there's 2% inflation, employers can just not give raises or give tiny raises, and real wages will fall without having to actually cut nominal wages, which would be demoralizing and might cause workers to quit. Cynical? Maybe, but it's how labor markets often work in practice. Voici la troisième partie, environ 9000 mots. Chapter 17. The grocery store. Shock. Why food inflation hurts the most. Let's get real for a minute. You know what makes people angrier about inflation than anything else? Grocery prices. You can tell someone that inflation is only 3% on average, and they'll look at you like you're insane because their grocery bill has doubled. And here's the thing, they might actually be right about their personal experience, even if the overall inflation number is accurate. Food prices are weird. They're volatile, they're visible, and they're unavoidable. You might be able to delay buying a new car or renovating your house, but you can't just stop eating. And unlike your mortgage payment or rent, which might stay fixed for years, you see food prices change in real time every time you go to the store. There's also a psychological phenomenon where we notice price increases way more than price decreases. Eggs went from $3 a dozen to $6 a dozen. You notice immediately and you're outraged. Eggs go back down to $4, you barely register it, and you certainly don't feel like you got a deal. You remember when they were $3. During the 2021 to 2023 inflation surge, food prices were one of the biggest drivers of public anger. Overall inflation peaked around 9%, but food inflation was running even higher in many categories. Eggs, as I mentioned, became absurdly expensive due to avian flu outbreaks. Meat prices surged. Even basic staples like bread and pasta got noticeably more expensive, and this hits low-income households disproportionately hard. If you're wealthy, food is a tiny fraction of your budget. You might not even notice if your grocery bill goes from $200 to $250 a week. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck and food is 20 to 30% of your budget, that same increase is devastating. You're making hard choices about what to buy, maybe skipping meals, definitely stressing about money constantly. This is why food price inflation has historically been politically explosive. Governments have fallen over bread prices. The French Revolution was partly triggered by food shortages and high grain prices. The Arab Spring in 2011 was sparked in part by soaring food costs. When people can't afford to feed their families, they get angry, and that anger can destabilize societies. Modern governments know this, which is why they often intervene in food markets more than other markets. Price controls, subsidies, strategic reserves, all designed to keep food affordable and avoid social unrest. But these interventions can create their own problems and distortions, which we'll get to later. Chapter 18. Housing, the inflation that broke a generation. If food inflation makes people angry, housing inflation makes them despair. Let's look at some numbers that will make you want to scream. In 1970, the median home price in the United States was about $23,000. The median household income was about $9,000. So, the median home cost roughly 2.6 times the median income. Fast forward to 2024. The median home price is around $420,000. The median household income is around $75,000. Now the median home costs about 5.6 times the median income. Housing has become more than twice as expensive relative to income. And in hot markets like San Francisco, New York, or Toronto, it's even worse. Homes can easily cost 10 to 15 times median income in these cities. This isn't just inflation, it's a fundamental affordability crisis, and it's destroying the financial prospects of younger generations. Here's why housing inflation is so pernicious. Housing is the biggest expense for most households, but it's also the primary way most people build wealth. When housing prices were reasonable relative to incomes, you could buy a house, pay it off over 30 years, and you'd own an appreciating asset that would fund your retirement, the American dream, right? But when housing prices far outpace wage growth, that model breaks down. Young people can't afford to buy homes. They're stuck renting, which means they're building zero equity. They're paying landlords' mortgages instead of their own. Meanwhile, people who already own homes see their wealth increase dramatically, but young people are locked out. This creates a massive intergenerational wealth transfer. Baby boomers bought houses when they were cheap and have watched those houses appreciate into retirement nest eggs worth hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. Millennials and Gen Z are struggling to scrape together down payments for houses that cost 5 to 10 times what their parents paid, adjusted for inflation. And here's the really maddening part. Housing inflation often isn't even counted properly in inflation statistics. Remember how CPI works? For housing, it doesn't actually measure home prices directly for homeowners. Instead, it uses something called owner's equivalent rent, basically what you could theoretically rent your house for. This made sense decades ago when the methodology was developed, but it creates bizarre distortions today. Home prices can be soaring while the CPI housing component stays relatively stable because rent increases lag behind home price increases. So official inflation statistics can understate how much housing affordability is deteriorating. There are complex reasons for housing inflation: zoning restrictions, NIMBY politics, construction costs, low interest rates inflating demand, foreign investment, private equity buying up housing stock, and more. It's not just monetary inflation. It's a combination of supply restrictions and demand pressures, but the result is the same: an entire generation that's worse off than their parents in terms of housing affordability, despite living in a richer society. That's not supposed to happen, and it's creating deep resentment and pessimism about the future. Chapter 19: The College Tuition Nightmare. You know what's had. Even more extreme inflation than housing? College tuition. Buckle up for these numbers. In 1980, the average cost of tuition and fees at a private four-year university was about $3,800 per year. Adjusted for general inflation, that would be about $14,000 in 2024 dollars. The actual average cost in 2024, over $42,000 per year. College costs have increased at roughly 3 times the rate of general inflation for the past 4 decades. It's one of the most extreme examples of sector-specific inflation in the modern economy. A student today faces tuition that's tripled in real terms compared to what their parents paid, and that's before we even get into room and board, textbooks, don't even get me started on textbook prices, and other expenses. The result is a student debt crisis that's crippling an entire generation. Outstanding student loan debt in the U.S. is over $1.7 trillion. The average borrower owes around $30,000, but many owe far more: $50,000, $100,000, even $200,000 plus for graduate and professional degrees. Think about what this means for a young person's financial trajectory. You graduate with massive debt. You're making debt payments that eat up a huge chunk of your income. This delays or prevents you from buying a house, starting a family, saving for retirement, starting a business, all the things that previous generations could do in their 20s and 30s. And unlike other forms of debt, student loans are nearly impossible to discharge in bankruptcy. You can default on a mortgage and lose your house, but at least the debt eventually goes away. Student loans follow you forever, or at least until you pay them off or die, and in some cases, they even survive death. Why has college gotten so expensive? That's a complicated question with no single answer. Some blame bloated administrative costs. Universities now have armies of administrators and fancy amenities that didn't exist decades ago. Some blame reduced state funding for public universities, which has shifted costs onto students. Some blame the availability of student loans themselves, arguing that easy credit allows universities to keep raising prices because students can always borrow more. There's probably truth to all of these explanations, but regardless of the cause, the effect is clear. Education inflation has created a debt burden that's fundamentally changing the economic prospects of younger generations. And here's a cruel irony. This is all happening at a time when a college degree is more necessary than ever for economic success. In previous generations, you could get a good middle-class job with just a high school diploma. Now, many entry-level jobs require a bachelor's degree. So young people are forced to take on crushing debt just to have a shot at the economic stability their parents achieved more easily. Chapter 20: Healthcare. The American Inflation Catastrophe. If you want to see truly insane inflation, look at American healthcare costs. In 1970, the U.S. spent about $75 billion on healthcare, or roughly $356 per person. By 2023, the US was spending over $4.5 trillion on healthcare, or about $13,500 per person. Even adjusting for general inflation, healthcare costs have increased by 4 to 5 times, and the US spends far more per capita on healthcare than any other developed country, roughly double what most European countries spend, while achieving worse health outcomes on many metrics. The inflation in healthcare costs is so extreme and so persistent that it's created multiple crises simultaneously. First, there's the personal financial crisis. Medical debt is the leading cause of bankruptcy in the United States. People with insurance still face huge bills because of deductibles, copays, and out-of-network charges. A serious illness or injury can financially destroy a family, even a relatively well-off family. Second, there's the business crisis. Employer-provided health insurance is one of the biggest costs for American businesses. Small businesses struggle to offer health benefits. Large corporations spend enormous amounts on employee health insurance, which reduces their competitiveness and limits their ability to give wage increases. Third, there's the government fiscal crisis. Medicare and Medicaid are massive and growing parts of the federal and state budgets. As healthcare costs continue to rise faster than general inflation, these programs consume more and more of government spending, crowding out other priorities. Why are healthcare costs inflating so rapidly? Again, it's complicated. There's the fundamental issue that healthcare doesn't work like normal markets. If you have a heart attack, you don't shop around for the best price. You go to the nearest hospital and get treated, and you'll pay whatever they charge because the alternative is death. There's the problem of insurance creating moral hazard when someone else is paying, insurance, government, both. Patients and providers have less incentive to care about costs. There's the issue of massive administrative overhead. American healthcare has layers upon layers of bureaucracy for billing, insurance verification, prior authorizations, and so on. By some estimates, administrative costs account for 25 to 30% of healthcare spending. There's the pharmaceutical industry, which charges Americans far more for drugs than they charge people in other countries, because they can. There's the consolidation of hospitals and healthcare providers, which reduces competition and allows them to raise prices. There's defensive medicine, where doctors order extra tests and procedures to protect against lawsuits, even when they're not medically necessary. And there's the genuine advancement of medical technology. We can do things now that were impossible decades ago, but those advanced treatments are expensive. All of these factors combine to create an inflationary spiral in healthcare that's far more severe than in the rest of the economy. And it's making healthcare unaffordable for millions of Americans while draining resources from other parts of the economy. Part 5. Fighting Inflation, the Tools and the Trade-offs. Chapter 21. The Federal Reserve and the Interest Rate Weapon. Alright, so we've established that inflation can be really bad. The obvious next question is, what can we do about it? Enter the Federal Reserve, or whatever your country's central bank is called. This is the institution primarily responsible for controlling inflation, and their main weapon is interest rates. Here's the basic logic. When inflation is too high, the Fed raises interest rates. Higher interest rates make borrowing more expensive. When borrowing is more expensive, people and businesses borrow less. When they borrow less, they spend less. When they spend less, demand for goods and services decreases. When demand decreases, prices stop rising as fast. Boom, inflation. Controlled. Simple, right? Well, yes and no. The mechanism is conceptually simple, but the execution is incredibly tricky. It's like trying to steer a massive ship. You turn the wheel, but the ship takes a long time to respond, and if you overcorrect, you might crash into an iceberg on the other side. Interest rate changes affect the economy with long and variable lags. As economists like to say, when the Fed raises rates today, the full impact might not be felt for 6 to 18 months. This makes it really hard to calibrate the response. How much do you raise rates? How fast? For how long? Raise rates too little or too slowly, and inflation keeps running hot. You look weak and ineffective. Inflation expectations become unanchored, and you eventually need to raise rates even more to regain credibility. But raise rates too much or too fast, and you trigger a recession. Businesses can't afford to borrow to invest. People can't afford mortgages or car loans. Unemployment rises. The economy crashes. This is the fundamental trade-off of monetary policy. fighting inflation versus supporting employment and growth. In the short run, you often can't optimize for both simultaneously. You have to choose your priority. Chapter 22: Paul Volcker and the Inflation Slaying of the 1980s. Let me tell you a story about the most badass inflation fight in modern history. Paul Volcker versus the Great Inflation of the 1970s. By 1979, inflation in the US had been running hot for nearly a decade. It was in double digits, 11%, 12%, sometimes higher. People were losing faith in the dollar. Inflation expectations were becoming entrenched. The economy was in what's called a wage price spiral, where inflation was feeding on itself. Enter Paul Volcker, who became Federal Reserve Chairman in August 1979. He was 6 feet 7 inches, smoked cheap cigars, and had absolutely zero patience for inflation. Volcker did something radical. He jacked up interest rates to levels that seem almost unbelievable today. The federal funds rate, the Fed's main interest rate tool, went above 20%. 20%. To put that in perspective, mortgage rates hit 18 to 19%. Credit cards charged 20% plus. Borrowing money became extraordinarily expensive, and it worked. But oh, did it hurt. The Volcker shock triggered a severe recession, actually 2 recessions, in 1980 and 1981 to 82. Unemployment hit nearly 11%. Entire industries were devastated. Construction stopped because nobody could afford mortgages. Manufacturing contracted sharply. Small businesses failed by the thousands. Volcker was vilified. Farmers drove tractors to Washington to protest. Homebuilders sent him 2x4s to symbolize the homes that weren't being built. He received death threats. Politicians demanded he reverse course, but Volcker held firm. He understood that breaking inflation required credibility. The public had to believe the Fed was serious about getting inflation under control, no matter the short-term pain. If he backed down, inflation expectations would remain high, and the whole effort would fail. By 1983, it was over. Inflation came down from double digits to around 3%. The recession ended, and the economy began a long expansion. The Great Inflation was dead. Volcker's aggressive approach established a template for fighting inflation that central banks still reference today. It proved that inflation can be defeated with sufficiently determined monetary policy, but it also demonstrated the painful trade-offs involved. The recession Volcker triggered destroyed jobs, bankrupted businesses, and caused enormous suffering. Was it worth it? Most economists say yes, that the long-term benefit of stable prices outweighed the short-term pain. But if you were one of the people who lost their job or their business in 1981, you might feel differently. Chapter 23: The 2020s. Inflation surge and how not to fight it fast. Forward to 2021 to 2023. And we gotta watch a new inflation fight unfold in real time. After years of low, stable inflation, indeed years where central banks were worried about inflation being too low, suddenly it exploded. By mid-2022, inflation in the US hit 9%, the highest in 40 years. Europe saw similar or higher rates. The causes were complex: COVID supply chain disruptions, massive fiscal stimulus, the Russia-Ukraine war affecting energy and food, changes in consumer behavior, and probably some corporate price gouging thrown in for good measure. Central banks initially dismissed it as transitory, just temporary disruptions that would resolve themselves. This was a huge mistake. By the time they acknowledged the problem and started raising rates aggressively in 2022, inflation was already well entrenched. The Fed raised rates from near zero to over 5% in less than 2 years, the fastest tightening cycle in decades. Other central banks followed similar paths. But here's what's fascinating. This time, the recession that everyone predicted didn't happen. At least not as of early 2025 when I'm speaking to you. Unemployment stayed low, the economy kept growing, inflation came down from 9% to around 3 to 4% without the economy crashing. Economists are still debating why. Some possibilities. Maybe the labor market was unusually tight due to demographic changes and pandemic-related shifts, making it more resilient. Maybe the inflation was genuinely more supply-side driven than demand-side, so raising rates didn't need to crush demand as much. Maybe we just got lucky with good timing. Supply chains improved, energy prices came down, and other factors helped even as rates rose. Or maybe the lag between rate increases and economic impact is longer than expected, and the recession is still coming. The point is, Fighting inflation is an art, not a science. Every episode is different. What worked in the 1980s might not work the same way in the 2020s because the economy has changed. Chapter 24. The fiscal side, government spending and taxes, monetary policy, interest rates, and central bank actions gets most of the attention when we talk about fighting inflation. But there's another set of tools, fiscal policy, meaning government spending and taxation. The logic here is straightforward. If inflation is being driven by too much demand in the economy, the government can reduce demand by spending less and slash or taxing more. Take money out of the economy, reduce purchasing power, and you reduce inflationary pressure. In practice, this is politically almost impossible. Think about it. You're a politician. There's high inflation. Your constituents are angry. The solution is to raise their taxes and cut government programs they like. Good luck getting reelected. This is why the burden of fighting inflation usually falls on central banks rather than elected governments. Central banks have political independence, at least in theory, and can make unpopular decisions without facing voters. Politicians have to get reelected, so they face enormous pressure to do things that might feel good in the short term but make inflation worse. Actually, governments often make inflation worse during inflationary periods by increasing spending to help people cope with rising prices. They subsidize energy, provide direct payments, increase government services, all of which inject more money into the economy and add to inflationary pressure. This is the paradox of democratic politics and inflation. The policies that would help fight inflation are politically toxic, while the policies that are politically popular often make inflation worse. There are exceptions. Governments do sometimes successfully use fiscal consolidation to fight inflation, particularly in developing countries dealing with very high inflation, where the crisis is so severe that the political calculus changes. But in developed democracies with moderate inflation, relying on fiscal policy is usually a non-starter. Chapter 25. Price controls. The temptation that never works. When inflation gets bad, there's always enormous political pressure to do something about high prices. And there's one policy that seems so obvious, so straightforward, that politicians keep trying it despite literally thousands of years of evidence that it doesn't work. Price controls. The idea is simple. Inflation means prices are too high, so just make it illegal to charge high prices. Problem solved, right? Wrong. So wrong. Price controls have been tried countless times throughout history, and they virtually never work. Remember Emperor Diocletian's edict on maximum prices in ancient Rome? Failed spectacularly. Price controls in the 1970s created shortages and black markets. Venezuela's price controls destroyed their economy. Here's why price controls fail. Prices aren't arbitrary numbers that evil corporations choose to maximize their greed. Prices are signals that convey information about supply and demand and coordinate economic activity. When you suppress prices below what the market would set, you create a few predictable problems. First, you create shortages. If the price is kept artificially low, demand exceeds supply, everyone wants to buy at the low price, but producers don't want to sell at that price, so goods disappear from shelves. Second, you create black markets. If people can't get goods at the official price, they'll pay higher prices on illegal markets. This pushes economic activity underground, beyond regulation and taxation. Third, you create quality degradation. If sellers can't raise prices but their costs are going up, they cut quality instead. You get smaller portions, cheaper ingredients, fewer features, shrinkflation on steroids. Fourth, you distort the entire economy. Resources don't flow to where they're most valued. Investment and production decisions get made based on artificial prices rather than real economic signals. This creates inefficiency and waste. The classic example is rent control, which many cities have tried. The theory: housing is too expensive, so cap rents at affordable levels. The reality: landlords stop maintaining properties, new housing doesn't get built, housing quality declines, and you end up with severe housing shortages. The people who get rent-controlled apartments benefit, but everyone else is worse off, and the overall housing stock deteriorates. Despite this overwhelming historical evidence, price controls remain politically tempting because they feel like they're doing something. They're visible, they're direct, and they create the appearance of fighting on behalf of consumers against greedy businesses. But economics doesn't care about your good intentions. Price controls have unintended consequences that usually make the underlying problems worse, even if they provide short-term political benefits to whoever implements them. Chapter 26. This inflation-unemployment trade-off, the Phillips curve. Let me introduce you to one of the most important and most controversial concepts in macroeconomics, the Phillips curve. Back in 1958, economist William Phillips observed a statistical relationship in UK data. When unemployment was low, inflation tended to be high. When unemployment was high, inflation tended to be low. There seemed to be a trade-off. This made intuitive sense. In a tight labor market with low unemployment, workers can demand higher wages, which pushes up costs and inflation. In a slack labor market with high unemployment, workers have less bargaining power, wage growth is subdued, and inflation stays low. For policymakers, this seemed to offer a menu of choices. You could choose lower unemployment if you were willing to accept higher inflation, or you could choose lower inflation if you were willing to accept higher unemployment. Just pick your spot on the curve. This framework dominated policy thinking for decades. But then, the 1970s happened. Suddenly, we had high inflation and high unemployment simultaneously, stagflation. The Phillips curve seemed to break down. You were supposed to be able to trade one for the other, but instead, we got both at once. Economists scrambled to explain this. Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps had already predicted it would happen, arguing that the Phillips curve trade-off only existed in the short run. In the long run, they said, there was no trade-off. You'd just get whatever inflation rate monetary policy delivered, with unemployment eventually settling at some natural rate determined by structural factors. Their theory, if policymakers tried to exploit the Phillips curve and keep unemployment artificially low by accepting higher inflation, inflation expectations would adjust, and you'd end up with high inflation but no long-term employment benefit. The curve would shift, and you'd be stuck with the worst of both worlds. The stagflation of the 1970s seemed to prove them right, and their theory became the new consensus. But here's where it gets weird. In recent years, the relationship seems to have broken down again, but in a different way. During the 2000s, unemployment got very low in many developed countries, but inflation stayed mysteriously subdued. The Phillips curve appeared to have flattened. Changes in unemployment weren't affecting inflation as much as the theory predicted. Then in 2021 to 2023, inflation surged even though unemployment was relatively low, which kind of fits the Phillips curve, but inflation came back down while unemployment stayed low, which doesn't fit. So where does this leave us? Honestly, economists aren't entirely sure. The Phillips curve is clearly too simple to capture everything going on in modern economies, but the underlying intuition that there's some relationship between labor market tightness and inflation still seems valid, even if the exact nature of that relationship keeps changing. For practical policy, this means central banks can't just rely on simple rules like unemployment is low, so we need to raise rates to prevent inflation. The economy is more complex than that, and the relationships between key variables keep shifting in ways we don't fully understand. Welcome to macroeconomics, where the more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know. Part 6. The weird cases when inflation gets really crazy. Chapter 27. Hyperinflation, when money becomes worthless. Let's talk about the absolute worst-case scenario, hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is technically defined as inflation exceeding 50% per month. Yes, per month. That means prices are doubling roughly every month and a half, but the really severe cases blow past even that threshold into territory that seems almost mathematically impossible. The most famous example is Weimar Germany in 1923. At the peak, prices were doubling every few days. Loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. Workers were paid twice per day because their morning wages would be worthless by afternoon. People brought wheelbarrows and suitcases full of cash to buy groceries. Children played with blocks made of bundled banknotes because the paper was worth more as toys than as money. But Weimar Germany isn't even the worst case. That honor might go to Hungary in 1946, where the highest denomination banknote reached 100 million billion pengo, that's 100 trillion, yes, 20 zeros, or Zimbabwe in 2008, where the government printed a $100 trillion banknote and inflation peaked at an estimated 79.6 billion% per month. More recently, Venezuela has experienced hyperinflation that's destroyed their economy. By 2018, annual inflation hit over 130,000%. The currency became so worthless that people stopped counting it. They weighed stacks of bills instead. Basic goods disappeared from stores. People fled the country by the millions. How does hyperinflation happen? It almost always follows a similar pattern. First, there's some underlying crisis: a war, political instability, economic collapse, massive debts. The government needs money but can't raise it through taxes or borrowing. Second, the government starts printing money to finance itself. At first, this seems to work. The government can pay its bills, fund its operations, avoid immediate collapse. Third, people notice money supply is increasing rapidly, prices start rising, people lose confidence in the currency. Fourth, velocity accelerates. People try to spend money as fast as they get it because they know it'll be worth less tomorrow. This acceleration of spending drives prices even higher. Fifth, the currency death spiral begins. As confidence collapses completely, people refuse to accept the currency. They demand foreign currency, gold, or barter. The domestic currency becomes essentially worthless. Sixth, the economy collapses. Trade breaks down, production stops, social order deteriorates. The country is forced to abandon the old currency and start fresh, usually after massive social and economic destruction. The lesson from every hyperinflation episode is the same. You cannot print your way to prosperity. There are real constraints on money creation. Violate them badly enough, and you destroy the currency entirely. What's terrifying is how quickly it can happen. Venezuela went from being one of the richest countries in Latin America to hyperinflationary collapse in less than a decade. Zimbabwe went from being the breadbasket of Africa to economic basket case even faster. Hyperinflation is rare in developed countries with strong institutions, but it's not impossible. It's a reminder of what happens when monetary discipline completely breaks down. Chapter 28. Deflation. The other monster. Now let's talk about deflation, which is when prices actually fall. You'd think this would be great, right? Everything getting cheaper? Wrong. Deflation can be just as dangerous as inflation, maybe more so. Here's why. When prices are falling, the rational thing to do is delay purchases. Why buy something today when it'll be cheaper tomorrow? This seems fine from an individual perspective, but when everyone does it, disaster ensues. Businesses see demand collapse, revenue falls, they cut production, lay off workers, unemployed workers spend even less. Demand falls further, prices fall more, and round in a deflationary spiral. It gets worse. Deflation increases the real value of debt. Remember how inflation helps debtors by letting them repay with cheaper dollars? Deflation does the opposite. You borrowed expensive dollars, and now you have to repay with even more expensive dollars. The real burden of your debt is increasing. This crushes anyone with debt, which in modern economies is most businesses, most households, and governments. Defaults increase. Banks fail. Credit markets freeze. The whole financial system can collapse. The Great Depression of the 1920s to 1930s involved severe deflation. Prices fell by about 25% from 1929 to 1933. This might sound good until you realize unemployment hit 25%, industrial production collapsed by half, and the banking system nearly disintegrated. More recently, Japan experienced mild but persistent deflation for decades, starting in the 1990s, the lost decades. Even though deflation was relatively modest, prices fell by maybe 1% per year. It was enough to stifle growth and keep the economy stagnant for a generation. Why is deflation so hard to fix? Because once it takes hold, people's expectations change. They expect prices to fall, so they wait to buy. They expect their debts to become more burdensome, so they try to pay them off rather than spend. These behaviors reinforce the deflation. Central banks can fight deflation by cutting interest rates to encourage spending and borrowing, but there's a problem. Interest rates can't go below zero, or at least they can't go much below zero. Once you hit this zero lower bound, traditional monetary policy runs out of ammunition. This is why Japan and other countries have experimented with unconventional monetary policies like quantitative easing, buying bonds and other assets, negative interest rates, yes, actually charging people to hold money in banks, and forward guidance, promising to keep rates low for extended periods. These policies have had mixed results. They prevented complete collapse, but they haven't been enough to generate strong growth or return to positive inflation targets. Once you're in a deflationary trap, escaping is remarkably difficult. The key lesson: a little inflation is actually healthy because it gives you buffer against deflation. This is why central banks target 2% inflation rather than 0%. That 2% cushion means even if there's a negative shock, you're unlikely to tip into deflation. Chapter 29. The Inflation Tax, the Hidden Way Governments Fund. Themselves, let me explain one of the most insidious aspects of inflation. It's effectively a hidden tax. Think about it. When the government creates new money, it gets to spend that new money at current prices before inflation kicks in. This is called seigniorage, the profit from printing money. The government gains purchasing power, and everyone else loses purchasing power as inflation rises. It's a transfer of wealth from the public to the government. Unlike regular taxes, the inflation tax doesn't require a vote. Congress doesn't need to pass a bill. There are no explicit tax forms. It's invisible, which makes it politically attractive. It's also regressive, meaning it hurts poor people more than rich people. Poor people hold a larger fraction of their wealth in cash and don't have sophisticated ways to protect against inflation. Rich people can invest in assets that appreciate with inflation: stocks, real estate, commodities. The poor just watch their savings erode. Historically, governments under fiscal stress have relied heavily on the inflation tax. It's how many countries have financed wars. Rather than raising explicit taxes, which is politically difficult, they just print money and let inflation transfer the resources. In extreme cases like Weimar Germany or modern Venezuela, the inflation tax became the primary means of government finance. The government was printing money furiously to pay its bills, which created hyperinflation, which destroyed the economy. But from the government's narrow perspective, it worked in the sense that they got the resources they needed, at least temporarily. Even moderate inflation functions as a tax. If inflation is 3% per year and you hold $10,000 in cash, you're effectively paying a $300 tax that year as your purchasing power declines. Multiply that across the entire economy, and it's a massive wealth transfer. This is one reason why some people, particularly libertarians and hard money advocates, are so opposed to fiat currency and inflationary monetary policy. They view it as an illegitimate form of taxation without representation. The government is taking your wealth through currency debasement, and you have no say in it. The counter-argument is that some inflation is necessary for a well-functioning modern economy, and the seigniorage revenue allows governments to provide public services with less reliance on distortionary taxes. But there's definitely a valid concern about governments abusing the money printing power. The key is having strong, independent central banks that can resist political pressure to finance government spending through inflation. When that independence breaks down, when the central bank becomes a tool of fiscal policy, you get into dangerous territory. Chapter 30. Asset bubbles and inflation's weird cousin. We need to talk about something that doesn't always get classified as inflation, but probably should be: asset price inflation. Throughout the 2000s and 10s, central banks kept interest rates near zero and printed trillions in new money through quantitative easing. And yet, consumer price inflation stayed mysteriously low, around 2% or less in most developed countries. Many economists and policymakers declared victory. We can print money without consequences. But there absolutely were consequences. The money didn't flow into consumer prices, it flowed into assets. Stock prices soared, real estate prices boomed, bond prices went to insane levels, driving yields to zero or even negative. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies experienced massive bubbles. This created enormous wealth for people who owned assets, primarily the wealthy. Meanwhile, people who didn't own assets, primarily the poor and middle class, saw no benefit. Their wages stagnated while the costs of the assets they wanted to buy, like houses, increased dramatically. So was this inflation? Technically, no. Inflation as officially measured only looks at consumer goods and services. Asset prices are excluded from CPI and similar measures. but functionally, it sure felt like inflation to anyone trying to buy a house or build wealth. The purchasing power of your wages in terms of assets, real estate, stocks, etc., was falling dramatically, even if the purchasing power in terms of consumer goods was relatively stable. This creates a bizarre situation where economists and policymakers say there's no inflation problem, while regular people feel like everything is becoming unaffordable. They're both kind of right, just looking at different things. Some economists argue we should include asset prices in our inflation measures. After all, if the goal is to maintain stable purchasing power, shouldn't that include the power to purchase assets, not just consumer goods? Others argue this would be a mistake. Asset prices are naturally volatile and reflect changing expectations about future earnings. Trying to stabilize them through monetary policy could prevent necessary adjustments and create other distortions. The compromise position is that central banks should care about asset bubbles and financial stability, even if they don't target asset prices explicitly. When asset prices seem to be getting out of hand, perhaps driven by excessive monetary stimulus, that should be a warning sign. The 2020s inflation surge actually proved this perspective somewhat vindicated. All that money creation in the 2000s didn't immediately cause consumer price inflation, but it arguably set the stage for the inflation that eventually arrived. The money was sloshing around in the financial system, and once it started flowing into the real economy through fiscal stimulus, supply chain disruptions, etc., consumer price inflation exploded. Chapter 31: Global Inflation, How It Spreads Across Borders. Inflation isn't confined by national borders. In our globalized economy, inflation in one country can spread to others through various channels. The most obvious channel is trade. If a major trading partner experiences inflation, the prices of goods you import from them go up. This imported inflation gets passed through to domestic consumers. For example, when Chinese manufacturing costs increase due to higher wages, energy costs, or whatever, the prices of Chinese-made goods sold in American stores increase. Americans experience inflation even though it originated in China's economy. Currency exchange rates create another channel. If your currency weakens relative to other currencies, imports become more expensive. This is a huge deal for countries that import a lot of essential goods like energy or food. Many developing countries experienced severe imported inflation in 2021 to 2022 when global commodity prices surged and the US dollar strengthened. Their currencies weakened against the dollar, making imported oil, wheat, and other essentials much more expensive in local currency terms, even though dollar prices had only increased moderately. There's also a policy transmission channel. When major central banks like the Federal Reserve raise interest rates, capital flows out of emerging markets back to the US, where you can now earn higher returns. This creates currency pressure in emerging markets, forcing their central banks to also raise rates even if their domestic economy doesn't warrant it. This is called monetary policy spillover, and it's one of the major complaints that developing countries have about how the global financial system works. US monetary policy, designed for US economic conditions, ends up constraining what other countries can do with their own monetary policy. Energy markets are a particularly important inflation transmission mechanism. Oil is priced globally in dollars. When oil prices spike due to OPEC decisions, Middle East conflicts, or whatever, countries around the world experience inflation simultaneously. This is what happened in the 1970s with the OPEC oil embargoes, and again in 2022 with the Russia-Ukraine war. Food markets work similarly. Wheat, corn, soybeans. These are globally traded commodities with prices set in international markets. A drought in Ukraine or crop failure in Argentina affects food prices everywhere. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated how supply chain disruptions can transmit inflation globally. Factory shutdowns in China created shortages worldwide. Shipping container shortages and port congestion affected the entire global trading system. Semiconductor shortages that started in Asia rippled through to affect car production in America and Europe. All of this means that fighting inflation in one country requires understanding global inflation dynamics. A small country can't really control its inflation rate if it's being driven by global factors. Even a large country like the US has limited ability to shield itself from global inflation pressures. This is frustrating for policymakers and citizens alike. You want your central bank to maintain price stability, but they're partially at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Part 7. The future. Where do we go from here? Chapter 32. The Modern Monetary Theory. Debate. Alright, let's wade into one of the most controversial debates in economics right now, modern monetary theory, or MMT. MMT advocates make a radical-sounding claim. Governments that issue their own currency can never run out of money and don't need to worry about deficits the way we traditionally think about them. The basic argument goes like this. When the US government wants to spend money, it doesn't need to first collect taxes or borrow. It can simply create new money to finance that spending. Taxes and borrowing serve other purposes, controlling inflation, influencing behavior, etc., but they're not funding mechanisms in any real sense. Therefore, MMT proponents say, the government should spend whatever is needed to achieve full employment and social goals. The only real constraint is inflation. As long as spending doesn't create inflation, there's no reason to worry about deficits or debt. If inflation does appear, raise taxes to remove money from the economy and reduce demand. Problem solved. Mainstream economists mostly think MMT is wrong, or at least dangerously misleading. Their critiques. First, while it's technically true that a government can create unlimited money, doing so creates inflation, which is a real constraint. MMT proponents acknowledge this, but mainstream economists think they underestimate how quickly inflation can spiral and how difficult it is to control once it starts. Second, the idea that you can just raise taxes to fight inflation is politically naive. When was the last time Congress quickly raised taxes in response to economic conditions? Tax policy is slow, politically contentious, and difficult to fine-tune. By the time taxes are raised enough to fight inflation, you've already had severe economic damage. Third, MMT seems to work okay in the US, which has the world's reserve currency and deep financial markets. But try it in Argentina or Turkey and see what happens. Those countries can't print unlimited money without immediately triggering currency collapse and hyperinflation. The COVID-19 pandemic was kind of an inadvertent test of MMT ideas. Governments did exactly what MMT advocates recommended: massive deficit spending, with central banks creating money to fund it, without worrying much about debt levels. In the short term, this prevented economic collapse and helped people through the crisis, but it also contributed to the highest inflation in 40 years. Was that worth it? Did the benefits of the spending outweigh the costs of the inflation? People disagree. MMT advocates say the inflation was mainly due to supply chain disruptions, not excessive spending, and would have happened anyway. Critics say the spending clearly contributed and we should have been more cautious. My take: MMT is asking important questions about how modern monetary systems actually work, and some of their critiques of conventional thinking are valid, but their policy prescriptions seem risky, particularly the casual attitude toward deficit spending and the assumption that inflation can be easily controlled through tax policy. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Deficits matter less than traditional economics suggested, but more than MMT suggests. We have more policy space than we thought, but there are still real constraints we need to respect. Chapter 33. Cryptocurrency and the Dream of Inflation-Proof Money. Let's talk about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency because they were explicitly designed as a response to inflation concerns. Bitcoin's creator, the mysterious Satoshi Nakamoto, explicitly cited concerns about fiat currency debasement as motivation. The very first Bitcoin block includes a newspaper headline, "Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks," a reference to the 2008 financial crisis and monetary expansion. Bitcoin's key feature is a hard cap. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins. No central bank can print more. No government can inflate the supply. It's designed to be absolutely scarce, like gold, but digital. Many Bitcoin advocates argue this makes it superior to fiat currency. Your dollars lose purchasing power over time due to inflation, but Bitcoin's supply is fixed, so it should maintain or increase value, in theory. There are a few problems with this reasoning. First, price stability and fixed supply are different things. Just because Bitcoin's supply is fixed doesn't mean its price is stable. In fact, Bitcoin has been insanely volatile, far more volatile than any fiat currency. It's gone from pennies to $60,000 plus and back multiple times. That's not useful as money for everyday transactions. Second, a deflationary currency creates its own problems. If Bitcoin is constantly appreciating, why would you ever spend it? You'd hoard it, waiting for it to be worth more. This is bad for an actual functioning economy where you need money to circulate. Third, a fixed money supply doesn't adapt to changing economic conditions. If the economy grows but money supply doesn't, you get deflation. If the economy contracts, you can't do monetary stimulus. You're locked into whatever the algorithm dictates. Fourth, Bitcoin hasn't actually proven to be a good inflation hedge. When inflation surged in 2021 to 2022, Bitcoin didn't protect holders. It crashed along with other risk assets. That said, cryptocurrency advocates are right about some things. Fiat currencies do lose purchasing power over time. Governments do have incentives to inflate. And there's value in having alternatives to state-controlled money. But Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies haven't yet proven to be the solution to inflation that their advocates claim. They're more like speculative assets than functional currencies. Stablecoins, cryptocurrencies pegged to fiat currencies like the dollar, might be more practical for actual transactions, but they don't solve the inflation problem, they just digitize fiat currency. The broader point, technology alone can't solve the fundamental economic trade-offs involved in monetary systems. Every monetary system involves choices about who has power, how that power is exercised, and who bears the costs of mistakes. Cryptocurrency shifts these trade-offs but doesn't eliminate them. Chapter 34. Central Bank Digital Currencies. The Government Strikes Back. While Bitcoin and private cryptocurrencies have gotten most of the attention, central banks around the world are developing their own digital currencies, CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. A CBDC would be government-issued digital money, kind of like having a bank account directly with the Federal Reserve instead of with a private bank. From a central bank perspective, CBDCs offer several advantages. They could make monetary policy more effective. Want to do negative interest rates? Just automatically reduce everyone's CBDC balance. Want to do helicopter money? Directly deposit into everyone's CBDC account. They could reduce reliance on private banks and payment systems. Why should Visa and MasterCard and banks extract fees from every transaction when the government could provide this infrastructure directly? They could improve financial inclusion. People without bank accounts could hold CBDCs on their phones. They could enhance monitoring of economic activity and help fight tax evasion and money laundering. But that last point reveals the dark side. CBDCs give governments unprecedented surveillance and control over economic activity. Every transaction could be monitored. Governments could program money to expire, use it or lose it, to only be spendable on certain things, or to be confiscated from political dissidents. China is already rolling out a digital yuan with exactly these capabilities. It's a powerful tool for social control, allowing the government to track and control economic behavior in ways never before possible. Western countries are being more cautious, but the trend seems clear. Digital currencies are coming, and they'll fundamentally change the relationship between governments, central banks, and citizens. What does this mean for inflation? It could go either way. On one hand, CBDCs give central banks more precise tools for monetary policy. They could potentially manage inflation more effectively than with current blunt instruments. On the other hand, CBDCs make it easier for governments to create money and spend it directly without going through banks. This could increase the temptation to use inflation as a financing tool. The technology itself is neutral. Whether CBDCs lead to better inflation control or worse inflation depends entirely on the institutions and incentives that govern how they're used. Chapter 35. Demographics and the coming inflation, or deflation. Here's something most inflation discussions ignore. Demographics matter, a lot. The developed world is aging rapidly. Birth rates have collapsed below replacement levels in most rich countries. The median age is increasing. Soon there will be more retired people than working people in many societies. This has profound implications for inflation, though economists disagree about what those implications are. The deflationary scenario goes like this. Old people spend less than young people. They're no longer buying houses, cars, or raising families. They're mostly just living on fixed incomes and drawing down savings. As populations age, overall demand declines. Less demand means less inflation, possibly deflation. Japan's experience, aging population, persistent deflation, might be a preview of what other countries face. The inflationary scenario goes the opposite direction. Old people are costly. They consume healthcare, they collect pensions and social security, they vote for policies that benefit retirees. Governments will face enormous fiscal pressure to fund these benefits. Where will the money come from? Taxes on a shrinking working-age population? Good luck with that politically. More likely, deficit spending and monetary expansion leading to inflation. Add to this the fact that an aging workforce means slower productivity growth. Fewer workers means less economic growth. Slower growth means less ability to service debts and fund promises. This increases the temptation to inflate away obligations. Then there's immigration. Many developed countries could offset aging through immigration, bringing in young workers to support the economy. But immigration is politically controversial. If countries choose to restrict immigration, they're choosing a path of demographic decline with all its economic consequences. Climate change adds another layer of uncertainty. Will it create inflationary supply shocks, droughts, crop failures, infrastructure damage, or deflationary demand destruction, economic disruption, migration crises, reduced investment? Honestly, nobody knows. We're in unprecedented demographic territory. The conventional models and historical patterns might not apply. What seems likely, inflation dynamics will be different in 2050 than they were in 1950 or even 2020. Policymakers will face new challenges requiring new approaches. The key is maintaining institutional flexibility and avoiding rigid commitments based on assumptions that may not hold in a dramatically different demographic and environmental context. Part 8. The Psychology and Perception of Inflation. Chapter 36. Why inflation feels worse than it actually is. Let's talk about something fascinating, the psychology of inflation. Because here's the weird thing. People's perception of inflation is almost always more negative than the actual numbers suggest. Economists have studied this extensively, and there's a consistent pattern. Ask people how much inflation they think there is, and they'll give you a number that's way higher than official statistics. During periods when CPI is running at 3%, surveys will show people think it's more like 6% or 8%. Why the disconnect? First, there's what psychologists call asymmetric attention. You notice price increases way more than price decreases. When gas goes from $3 to $4 per gallon, you're acutely aware of it every time you fill up. When it goes back down to $3.50, you barely register the decrease. Your brain is wired to pay attention to losses more than gains. Think about the last time you went grocery shopping. I bet you noticed that eggs were more expensive, or that your favorite cereal went up in price. But did you notice that bananas were cheaper, or that the store brand pasta was on sale? Probably not with the same intensity. This creates what economists call negativity bias in inflation perception. Your mental inflation rate is calculated based mainly on the things that got more expensive, while discounting or ignoring the things that got cheaper or stayed the same. Second, there's the frequency effect. You buy groceries every week, fill up your gas tank regularly, maybe grab coffee daily. These high-frequency purchases are very visible, but the things that might have gotten cheaper, like electronics, clothing, or household goods, you buy less frequently, so the inflation you see most often is weighted toward frequently purchased items. And guess what? Food and energy, the things you buy most often, also tend to be the most volatile and often have higher inflation rates than other categories. So your personal experience is skewed toward the high inflation items. Third, there's what's called quality adjustment blindness. Remember how we talked about CPI adjusting for quality improvements? Well, regular people don't think that way. If a laptop cost $500 10 years ago and costs $500 today, you think same price, no inflation. But that laptop today is vastly more powerful. Economists say it's actually cheaper on a quality adjusted basis. You just think it costs the same. This creates a fundamental mismatch. Official statistics say things are getting cheaper when you account for quality improvements. Your wallet says, I'm still paying the same amount. Fourth, housing is the elephant in the room. For most people, housing is their biggest expense, and housing costs, whether rent or mortgage payments, are very salient. You write that check every month, you can't forget about it. But remember how CPI measures housing costs? Through owner's equivalent rent and actual rent, which lag behind home prices and don't fully capture the experience of people trying to buy homes in expensive markets. So if you're a young person trying to buy your first house, your personal inflation rate for housing is way higher than what CPI shows. The official statistics might say housing inflation is 4%, but if you're trying to buy a house that cost $200,000 5 years ago and now costs $350,000, your experience is more like 75% inflation over 5 years. That's 12% annual inflation in housing, 3 times the official rate. Chapter 37, Inflation Expectations and the Self-Fulfilling Prophecy. Here's one of the weirdest and most important aspects of inflation. Expectations matter as much as reality, maybe more. If people expect inflation to be high, they change their behavior in ways that actually cause high inflation. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Here's how it works. Imagine you expect 5% inflation over the next year. What do? If you're a worker, you demand a 5% raise or more to keep up. If you're a business owner, you preemptively raise your prices because you expect your costs to go up. If you're thinking about making a purchase, you might buy now rather than wait, since you expect prices to rise. Now multiply this across millions of people and thousands of businesses. Everyone's demanding higher wages, everyone's raising prices, everyone's trying to spend before prices go up. And what happens? Inflation actually does hit 5% or even higher because everyone's behavior made it happen. This is why central banks are obsessed with anchoring inflation expectations. They want people to believe that inflation will stay around 2%. If people believe that, they'll moderate their wage demands, businesses will be more cautious about raising prices, and actual inflation is more likely to stay around 2%. But if expectations become unanchored, if people stop believing the central bank will keep inflation under control, you can spiral into much higher inflation. Very quickly, the 1970s demonstrated this beautifully, in a terrible way. Once people came to expect high inflation, it became incredibly difficult to get rid of. Workers demanded higher wages based on expected inflation. Businesses raised prices based on expected cost increases. Long-term contracts included automatic inflation adjustments. The whole economy became indexed to inflation expectations. Breaking this cycle required Paul Volcker's brutal interest rate shock, which essentially said to the entire economy, "We're serious about fighting inflation even if it means a severe recession. Adjust your expectations accordingly." It worked, but only because Volcker's actions were so dramatic that they forced people to update their expectations. If he'd been more timid, expectations would have remained high and inflation would have persisted. This is also why central bank credibility matters so much. If people trust that the Fed will keep inflation around 2%, expectations stay anchored and the Fed's job is easier. But if people lose faith, if they think the Fed is willing to tolerate higher inflation or won't raise rates enough to fight it, expectations can shift rapidly. In 2021 to 2022, we saw this dynamic play out in real time. Initially, both the Fed and the public expected the inflation surge to be temporary, but as inflation persisted month after month, expectations started shifting. Surveys showed people expecting higher inflation further into the future, wage demands increased, businesses raised prices more aggressively. The Fed had to act decisively to prevent expectations from becoming completely unanchored. That's a big part of why they raised rates so aggressively in 2022 to 2023. Chapter 38, The Political Economy of Inflation, Why It Destroys Governments. Let's talk about why politicians are absolutely terrified of inflation. Because inflation doesn't just hurt the economy, it destroys political careers and sometimes entire governments. There's a strong historical pattern. High inflation leads to political upheaval. Governments get voted out. Sometimes they get overthrown. Inflation creates a level of public anger that's politically toxic. Why is inflation so politically dangerous? First, it's universal and unavoidable. If unemployment is high, that's terrible for the people who are unemployed, but most people still have jobs. If there's a recession, it hurts, but the pain is distributed unevenly. But inflation, everyone experiences it. Every single person who buys anything feels it. You can't escape it. Second, it's visible and constant. You see it every time you shop, every time you buy gas, every time you pay rent. The pain is continuous and in your face. Compare that to something like the national debt, which is abstract and distant. Inflation is immediate and personal. Third, it feels unfair and out of control. People understand unemployment. Sometimes businesses fail, sometimes jobs are lost. But inflation feels like theft. You worked hard, you earned money, and now that money buys less through no fault of your own. Someone, somewhere, must be responsible for this injustice. and voters will punish whoever they perceive as responsible, which usually means the incumbent government. Look at the historical record. Jimmy Carter lost the 1980 election largely because of inflation. The Weimar Republic collapsed partly due to hyperinflation. Numerous Latin American governments have been overthrown following inflation crises. Even in 2022 to 2024, inflation contributed to political defeats for incumbent parties across democracies worldwide. There's even research showing that inflation is politically more damaging than unemployment, even though economically unemployment might be worse. A 1% increase in inflation seems to cost more votes than a 1% increase in unemployment. This is partly because inflation affects everyone, while unemployment affects a smaller percentage of the population directly. This creates an interesting political incentive structure. Politicians have strong incentives to keep inflation low in the medium to long term because high inflation will destroy them politically, but they also have incentives to pursue short-term policies that might create inflation later: stimulus spending, monetary expansion, populist economic policies, because the political benefits come now and the inflation costs come later, hopefully after the next election. This is why independent central banks are so important. If monetary policy were directly controlled by elected politicians, the temptation to print money before elections would be enormous. Independent central banks, at least in theory, can make unpopular decisions to prevent inflation without worrying about immediate political consequences. Of course, central bank independence is always somewhat limited. Central bankers are appointed by politicians. They operate within political systems. They face political pressure, but the institutional structure creates at least some insulation from day-to-day political concerns. Chapter 39: Inflation and Inequality, the Hidden Redistributor. We've touched on this before, but let's dive deeper into how inflation affects inequality because this is one of the most important and underappreciated aspects of the whole phenomenon. Inflation is a massive redistributor of wealth. It takes from some people and gives to others, often in ways that exacerbate existing inequalities. Let's break down the winners and losers more systematically. Winners? 1. Debtors with fixed-rate debt. If you have a 30-year fixed mortgage, inflation is fantastic for you. Your payment stays the same, but you're paying it with increasingly cheaper dollars. The real burden of your debt decreases. 2. People who own real assets. Stocks, real estate, commodities, businesses. These tend to appreciate with or faster than inflation. If you own a house, its nominal value goes up. If you own stocks, corporate earnings often rise with inflation, pushing up stock prices. 3. Young people with good career prospects. If you're early in your career with rising wages, inflation helps you. Your salary increases to keep up with inflation, hopefully more than keeping up, while any debts you have decrease in real value. 4. Governments with large debts. Inflation reduces the real value of government debt, making it easier to service. Losers. 1. Savers and people on fixed incomes. If you have money in a savings account or are living on a fixed pension, inflation destroys your purchasing power. 2. Creditors. If you lent money at a fixed rate, you're being paid back in cheaper dollars than you lent out. 3. People without assets. If you don't own stocks or real estate, you don't benefit from asset price appreciation. You're purely losing purchasing power. 4. Elderly people. They're typically on fixed incomes, hold more wealth in cash and bonds, and have less ability to increase their income through work. Now here's the kicker. Wealth inequality in modern societies means the rich are much more likely to be in the winners category, and the poor are much more likely to be in the losers category. The rich own stocks and real estate. They have financial advisors who help them protect against inflation. They have diversified portfolios. Some inflation actually helps them by increasing the nominal value of their assets. The poor hold whatever wealth they have in cash or savings accounts. They're more likely to be creditors through those savings than debtors. They don't own homes or stocks. Inflation hits them harder. Middle-class people are mixed. If you own a home with a mortgage, you're benefiting as a debtor and from home price appreciation. But if you're saving for retirement or your kids' education, inflation is hurting those savings. This creates a perverse dynamic where periods of high inflation often coincide with increasing inequality. The wealth gap widens not just because the rich are getting richer in absolute terms, but because inflation is actively transferring wealth from the bottom to the top. The post-2008 period is a perfect example. Central banks created enormous amounts of money through QE, asset prices soared. The stock market hit record after record. Real estate boomed in major cities. Billionaires got vastly richer. Meanwhile, wage growth was sluggish. Consumer price inflation was moderate but persistent. People without assets saw their purchasing power stagnate or decline while watching asset owners get rich. Then when consumer price inflation finally surged in 2021 to 2022, it hit the poor hardest because they spend a larger share of their income on necessities like food and energy, which had the highest inflation rates. Chapter 40. The Geography of Inflation. Why it hits different places differently. Here's something that doesn't get enough. Attention! Inflation varies dramatically by location, but we usually only talk about national averages. The official U.S. inflation rate might be 3%, but that's averaging together San Francisco, where housing costs are insane, rural Mississippi, where they're much lower, New York City, where everything is expensive, and small-town Iowa, where it's cheaper. Your actual experienced inflation depends enormously on where you live. Housing is the biggest driver of geographic inflation differentials. In expensive coastal cities, San Francisco, New York, Boston, Seattle, Los Angeles, housing inflation has been astronomical for decades. A house that cost $100,000 in 1990 might be worth $1.5 million today in San Francisco. That's 9% annual inflation in housing for 34 years, far higher than official CPI. But in many smaller cities and rural areas, housing prices have increased much more modestly, maybe 3 to 4% annually, roughly in line with overall inflation. This creates wildly different economic realities. If you live in San Francisco and you're trying to buy a house, you're experiencing crushing inflation in your biggest expense category. The official 3% inflation rate seems like a sick joke, but if you live in a small town in the Midwest where housing is affordable, 3% inflation might actually overstate your experience. Your costs might be rising more slowly than the national average. Food prices also vary geographically, though less dramatically than housing. Urban areas tend to be more expensive. Food deserts, areas without easy access to grocery stores, force people to buy from convenience stores at higher prices. Energy costs vary by region based on climate, energy sources, and local regulations. Heating costs are higher in cold climates. Air conditioning costs are higher in hot climates. States with high gas taxes have higher transportation costs. This geographic variation in inflation has huge implications for inequality and mobility. If you're stuck in a high inflation area because that's where the jobs are, you're worse off than someone in a low inflation area with a similar nominal income. It also creates political tensions. People in high-cost areas feel like the economy is failing them, even if official statistics look okay. This contributes to the perception that economists and policymakers are out of touch, and it affects policy responses. The Fed sets one interest rate for the entire country, but maybe New York needs much tighter policy to control housing inflation, while rural areas need looser policy to stimulate growth. There's no way to perfectly calibrate policy for all regions simultaneously. Some countries have experimented with regional inflation measures and even regional policies, but it's complicated and politically fraught. Usually, we just live with the geographic variation and accept that national averages hide as much as they reveal. Chapter 41. Shrinkflation, Skimpflation, and Other Sneaky Tactics. Let's talk about the sneaky ways companies raise prices without actually raising prices. Because in the modern economy, there are lots of creative ways to effectively increase prices while technically keeping the price tag the same. First, there's shrinkflation. This is when the package gets smaller, but the price stays the same. Your bag of chips used to be 12 ounces, now it's 10 ounces, but it still costs $3.99. Effectively, you're paying 20% more per ounce, but you might not even notice because the price is the same. Companies love this because it's less visible than a price increase. People notice when the price tag changes from $3.99 to $4.79. They're much less likely to notice that the package got a bit smaller. Food companies are masters of shrinkflation. Chocolate bars get thinner, cereal boxes get shorter, ice cream containers go from 1.5 quarts to 1.25 quarts. The price stays at $4.99, and most people never notice. The only reason we know about this is because Researchers actually weigh and measure products over time, and what they find is that shrinkflation is incredibly common and adds significantly to real inflation beyond what official statistics capture. Then there's skimpflation, when quality decreases while price stays the same. Your favorite restaurant uses cheaper ingredients, your hotel provides fewer amenities, your airline crams in more seats and reduces legroom. The subscription service you pay for has more ads and fewer features. Technically, the price hasn't increased, but you're getting less value for your money, which is functionally equivalent to inflation. There's also dripflation or feeification, when the base price stays the same, but companies add more fees and charges. Airlines pioneered this. The ticket price might not increase much, but now you pay extra for checked bags, seat selection, priority boarding, and basically everything except breathing the cabin air. Hotels do it too. The room rate might be $100, but then there's a $30 resort fee, a $10 parking fee, a $5 Wi-Fi fee, and suddenly you're paying $145. Restaurants have gotten in on the action with service charges, delivery fees, and various other add-ons that increase the final bill while keeping menu prices nominally stable. The problem is that official inflation statistics struggle to capture these tactics. CPI looks at the price of a standard unit of something, but if that unit is shrinking or degrading in quality, the real cost is going up even if the nominal price isn't. Some statistical agencies try to adjust for this, but it's really hard. How do you quantify the reduced quality of airline travel? How do you factor in all the various fees that didn't exist before? The result is that measured inflation probably understates real inflation, especially for consumers. Companies have gotten very sophisticated at raising effective prices in ways that don't show up in inflation statistics. Chapter 42: Inflation in the Digital Age, when software eats your wallet. Let's talk about a form of inflation that's increasingly dominating modern life, but barely shows up in traditional statistics: subscription inflation. 20 years ago, you bought software once. You paid $50 for Microsoft Office and you owned it forever. You bought a DVD, you owned the movie. You bought a video game, it was yours. Now, everything is a subscription. Netflix, Spotify, Adobe Creative Cloud, Microsoft 365, your gym, your meal kit service, your meditation app, your cloud storage, your news websites, your gaming services. The list is endless. And here's the thing, these subscriptions are experiencing their own inflation, often much faster than the general inflation rate. Netflix started at $7.99 per month for streaming in 2010. By 2024, the standard plan is $15.49. That's nearly double, roughly 5.4% annual inflation, well above the general CPI average for that period, and they've added cheaper ad-supported tiers to make the increase seem less severe, but the comparable service costs twice as much. Adobe Creative Suite used to cost around $2,600 for a perpetual license. Expensive, yes, but you owned it. Now it's Adobe Creative Cloud at $60 per month. That's $720 per year, every year, forever. Over 10 years, you'll pay $7,200 for something you used to be able to buy once for $2,600. This subscriptionification of the economy creates a new form of inflation that's particularly insidious because, first, it's death by 1,000 cuts. Each individual subscription seems small. What's $10 a month? But add up 20 or 30 subscriptions, which many people now have, and you're paying $300 to $500 per month for services that might have cost you $1,000 to $2,000 upfront 10 years ago. Second, it's sticky. Once you're locked into a subscription ecosystem, switching is painful. Your data is there, your habits are formed. Canceling is deliberately made annoying. So companies can raise prices knowing many customers will just accept it rather than go through the hassle of canceling. Third, it's often hidden from inflation statistics. CPI doesn't necessarily track all these digital services comprehensively, especially newer ones. The subscription model is relatively new at scale, and statistical agencies haven't fully adapted their baskets to capture this shift in consumption patterns. Fourth, the value proposition keeps changing. You subscribed to Netflix when it had everything. Now content is fragmented across Netflix, Disney+, Hulu, HBO Max, Apple TV+, Paramount+, and dozens of others. To get the same breadth of content you had from Netflix alone in 2015, you now need 5 to 7 subscriptions. The effective price has increased massively, even if each individual subscription seems reasonably priced. This is also creating a new class divide. Wealthy people can afford all the subscriptions. They get ad-free experiences, premium features, and comprehensive access to content and services. Poor people either go without, use ad-supported versions, which are deliberately degraded to push you toward premium, or pirate content. The digital economy is increasingly tiered, with your economic status determining your quality of experience, and the companies know exactly what they're doing. They're boiling the frog slowly, raise prices 10% this year, add another 8% next year, introduce a new premium tier, gradually degrade the base tier to push people to upgrade. Before you know it, you're paying triple what you started paying, and it happened so gradually you barely noticed. Chapter 43, The Cantillon Effect. Why the first receivers of money win. Let me introduce you to a concept that's over 300 years old, but more relevant than ever, the Cantillon Effect, named after Irish-French economist Richard Cantillon. The basic idea is simple but profound. When new money is created, it doesn't affect everyone equally or simultaneously. The people and institutions who receive the new money first benefit at the expense of those who receive it last. Here's why. When new money enters the economy, the first receivers can spend it at current prices before those prices have adjusted to the larger money supply. They get the full purchasing power of that new money. But as that money circulates through the economy, prices begin to rise. By the time the new money reaches people further down the chain, prices have already increased, so their purchasing power is reduced. Essentially, there's a wealth transfer from the last receivers to the first receivers. In modern economies, who are the first receivers of newly created money? Banks and financial institutions. When the Federal Reserve does quantitative easing, who gets that money? Banks. When interest rates are lowered, who can borrow huge amounts at cheap rates? Banks and wealthy individuals with good credit and collateral. These first receivers can then invest that money in assets, stocks, real estate, bonds, before asset prices fully adjust. They get to buy assets cheap and watch them appreciate as the monetary stimulus works through the economy. Who are the last receivers? Wage workers, ordinary employees. By the time wages adjust to reflect the new, larger money supply, asset prices have already increased. The purchasing power of wages in terms of assets has decreased. This is a huge part of why wealth inequality has increased so dramatically in recent decades. The massive monetary expansion after 2008 and again after 2020 disproportionately benefited those closest to the money spigot. If you were a bank or a wealthy investor in 2009, you had access to essentially free money through low interest rates and various Fed programs. You could borrow at near zero rates and invest in assets that were temporarily depressed. As those assets recovered and monetary stimulus pushed prices up, you made enormous returns. If you were a wage worker, you got, eventually maybe, a modest wage increase years later after all the asset appreciation had already happened. The Cantillon effect explains why monetary expansion doesn't just cause inflation, it causes inequality. The distribution mechanism matters as much as the quantity of money created. This is also why some economists, particularly those in the Austrian school, are so critical of central bank monetary expansion. They argue it's not just about inflation in a general sense, it's about who benefits from that inflation. And the beneficiaries are systematically those already wealthy and connected to the financial system. Modern monetary policy essentially involves creating money and funneling it through the banking and financial system, which ensures that wealthy people benefit first and most. By the time that money trickles down to ordinary workers through wage increases, much of the benefit has already been captured by asset owners. You can see this in the data. After every major round of monetary stimulus, the wealth gap widens. Stock ownership is concentrated among the wealthy, so when stock prices soar due to monetary expansion, the wealthy benefit disproportionately. Real estate is similar. Homeowners benefit from price appreciation, but first-time buyers are locked out by those same price increases. The Cantillon effect is one of those ideas that once you understand it, you can't unsee it. It explains so much about why monetary policy, even when successful at managing inflation or stimulating growth, tends to increase inequality. Chapter 44, The Inflation Growth Paradox. Here's something that confuses a lot of people. Sometimes inflation and economic growth go together, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you get high inflation with strong growth, sometimes high inflation with weak growth, sometimes low inflation with strong growth, and sometimes low inflation with weak growth. What gives? Why isn't there a consistent relationship? The answer is that inflation can come from different sources, and the growth implications depend on what's driving it. Good inflation with growth. This happens when the economy is booming. Demand is strong, businesses are expanding, unemployment is low, wages are rising, the economy is running hot, and prices rise because there's genuine productive activity and income growth driving demand. This is demand pull inflation in a healthy economy. In this scenario, yes, inflation is higher, but people can afford it because their incomes are also rising. Real living standards might even be improving despite the inflation. Bad inflation without growth, stagflation. This happens when inflation is driven by supply shocks or cost push factors while the economy is weak. Oil prices spike, but the economy is already struggling. Costs go up, businesses pass them on as price increases, but demand is weak, so they're not selling more. They might even be cutting back. Result, prices rising, but growth is stagnant or negative, unemployment is high, and people's real incomes are falling. This is the worst case scenario. Low inflation with strong growth. This is the Goldilocks scenario that policymakers dream of. The economy is growing nicely, productivity is improving, people are getting richer in real terms, but inflation stays low and stable. The 1990s in the US were kind of like this: strong growth, low unemployment, but inflation stayed contained. Low inflation with weak growth or deflation with recession. This is what Japan experienced for decades. The economy is stagnant, growth is weak or negative, but inflation is also very low or even negative. This might sound okay, at least prices aren't rising, but remember that deflation creates its own problems and is often associated with economic weakness. The key insight is that inflation itself isn't inherently good or bad for growth. What matters is what's causing the inflation and what else is happening in the economy. Moderate inflation in a growing economy? Probably fine, maybe even helpful as a sign of healthy demand. High inflation in a stagnant economy? Disaster. You're getting all the pain of rising prices without any of the benefit of rising incomes. This is why policymakers care so much about the source of inflation. Demand-driven inflation in a strong economy is a very different problem from supply shock inflation in a weak economy, even if the inflation rate is numerically the same. And this is why fighting inflation isn't as simple as just raise interest rates. If inflation is coming from supply shocks, like COVID disruptions or the Ukraine war affecting energy, raising interest rates might just kill growth without actually solving the inflation problem, because the inflation isn't being driven by excess demand. You could end up creating stagflation, using tight monetary policy to slow down an already weak economy while supply-driven inflation persists. This was actually a real debate in 2022 to 2023. Some economists argued that much of the inflation was supply-side and would resolve itself as supply chains normalized. So aggressive rate hikes were unnecessary and risked causing a recession for no reason. Other economists argued that there was also a significant demand component from fiscal stimulus and that rates needed to rise substantially to prevent inflation from becoming entrenched. Who was right? Well, the Fed raised rates aggressively, inflation came down, and we didn't get a severe recession, at least not yet as of early 2025. So maybe the aggressive approach worked, or maybe we just got lucky with timing as supply chains improved. The point is, the relationship between inflation and growth is complicated and context dependent. There's no simple rule. Every situation requires analysis of what's actually driving prices and growth, not just looking at the numbers in isolation. Conclusion: living with inflation. So we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about what inflation is, how it works, how it's measured, who it helps and hurts, how governments fight it, and what the future might hold. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this video, it's that inflation is complicated. It's not just prices go up. It's a complex phenomenon that reflects deep forces in the economy: money creation, supply and demand, expectations, institutions, politics, and more. And there are no easy answers. Every policy choice involves trade-offs. Fighting inflation too aggressively causes recessions and unemployment, Not fighting it aggressively enough allows it to spiral out of control. Trying to suppress it with price controls creates shortages and black markets. Creating money to fund government spending helps in the short term, but risks inflation in the long term. Different people are affected differently by inflation. If you're young with debt, some inflation helps you. If you're old with savings, inflation hurts. If you own assets, asset price inflation has made you rich. If you don't, you've been left behind. The measured inflation rate might not reflect your personal experience. Official statistics say one thing, but your grocery bill and rent payment might tell a different story. And the experts genuinely disagree about fundamental questions. How much inflation is optimal? What causes inflation? How should we fight it? These aren't settled questions with clear answers. They're ongoing debates where intelligent people look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions. So what should you do with this knowledge? First, understand that inflation is a real force that will affect your financial life. Plan for it. Don't keep all your money in cash where inflation will erode it. Think about investments, assets, skills, things that can maintain value even as currency loses purchasing power. Second, be skeptical of simple explanations and easy solutions. When someone tells you inflation is caused by just one thing, greedy corporations, government spending, the Federal Reserve, whatever, they're probably oversimplifying. Reality is messy. Third, pay attention to the actual data and trends, not just what politicians or media personalities say. Look at multiple inflation measures, understand what you're reading, be informed. Fourth, recognize the political and social dimensions. Inflation isn't just an economic phenomenon, it's a political one. It redistributes wealth and power. It creates winners and losers. The debates about inflation are really debates about what kind of society we want and who should bear what costs. Finally, have some humility. Even the experts are often wrong about inflation. The models break down, the relationships change, the future surprises us. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand it. It just means we should approach these issues with appropriate caution and recognize that there's a lot we don't know. Inflation has been with us for thousands of years, and it'll be with us for thousands more. It's a fundamental feature of monetary economies. Understanding it won't make it go away, but it will make you better equipped to navigate its effects and make informed decisions. Your money is slowly losing value right now as you're watching this, but now you understand why, how, and what that means. And that understanding is valuable. Maybe not in dollars and cents, but in your ability to operate effectively in a complex economic world. Thanks for watching this deep dive into inflation. If you found it helpful, leave a like, subscribe, share it with someone who needs to understand this stuff. And let me know in the comments, what's your personal experience with inflation been? How has it affected your life? What questions do you still have? Until next time, stay informed, stay skeptical, and try not to keep all your wealth in cash under your mattress. That's a losing game in an inflationary world.